You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 26th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Are any of the UK's overseas allies paying attention beyond pointing and laughing to its election? Should Nato really be led by a former Prime Minister whose governments never once matched the alliance's theoretical minimum contribution? And would your patriotic heart be stirred by seeing your nation's flag very high up? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Tessa Szyszkowicz and Robin Lustig will discuss the day's big stories, and our On This Day historical feature will recall the key Cold War speech, which was overrun by a misbegotten myth. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Tessa Szyszkowicz, UK correspondent for the Austrian weekly magazine Falter and the author of Echte Engländer, Britain and Brexit, and by Robin Lustig, journalist and broadcaster, former presenter of The World Tonight on Radio 4. Hello to you both.
Hi, Andrew. Good evening.
Tessa, how recently have you peeled off the 2 red stripes and 1 white stripe horizontal bar face makeup Austria? This is my way of saying doing quite well at the football.
You know, Andrew, that usually I'm not a very patriotic Austrian. I'm a runaway Austrian. But yesterday night, even I felt my heart beating faster because they won.
You're a bandwagon jumping Austrian is what you're saying.
Absolutely. It's absolutely what I do.
Yeah.
And I'm also, I like watching football games from time to time, but I wouldn't watch all the games. But when you have the feeling there's a sort of, sudden rush and people get really excited and also they play well, then you sort of just give into it and then it all works out.
Whereas you, Robin, still have your St George's Cross face paint on.
It's a good thing there's radio, isn't it? I haven't watched any football yet. If England get
what you were going to say ever.
No, I have watched some football. If England get to the finals, I'll watch that.
Okay.
I'm pretty confident I won't be watching.
When you say the finals, what's the benchmark here? The actual final?
The actual final. Yeah.
So not even the semi-final? You don't tune in for that?
I shouldn't have thought so. I think if it was England-Germany, I might, just because of the history. But otherwise...
Yeah, that's always spicy. But, I have to tell you that England has less points than Austria at the moment. It might change in the next days, but...
Well, let's hear it for Austria, right?
So Tessa, will you be tuning into all forthcoming Austrian fixtures, however many or few of them it may turn out there are?
Do I have to commit now?
Well, you do now.
But it depends on the other programs that might be available. Elections in France, in Britain, in all sorts of places where the exit polls might be more exciting than football games.
But Tessa, to our vast global listenership, you are now the voice of Austria. You can't desert them at this point.
Yes, I would definitely sort of, pay attention.
Well,
I think so too.
We will be starting in the UK, which is now 8 days away from its general election. Opinion polls suggest that, on the whole, the British people are very much looking forward to seeing the back of the Conservative Party, but it seems reasonable to suppose that this sentiment is widely shared across Europe, Europe having been obliged to help mop up the blood after the UK shot itself in the foot back in 2016. Ironically, however, a lot of Europe may have cause to regard the presumptive landslide election of Labour with an amount of wistfulness, the UK pivoting centre-left as much of the continent lurches populist right. Tessa, speaking not only for Austria but for the entirety of continental Europe, I mean, you're the only one who's here, how much do Europeans care about a British election?
Well, there are different interpretations. I think one problem is that Rishi Sunak called the election for the 4th of July just in between the first and the second run in France.
He didn't know that at the time, though.
No, I know, of course, it's a joke. But it's sort of the problem is there are such big other things happening that the UK elections is sort of like a medium power without partners or plans going to the polls with one of the parties leading 20 plus points in front of the governing Conservative Party. So the fact that Labour will come in as a government with high probability makes it, of course, also a little bit less interesting to watch now the exit polls. And so we've all written all the stories that people were possibly interested in. Who could be the new prime minister is sort of check. Yeah? Who is really making a fool out of themselves in this election campaign with betting against themselves?
That's a long list.
Check. Yeah. So we have really done a few things, but I think one of the reasons why Europe is also not looking so closely is the only real news would be if Labour would say, now we are trying to come back to the European Union and how do we do that? And since there's Brexit omerta being declared here by both big parties and even by the Liberal Democrats, I think the big issues are not being discussed, and this silence, we just answer with silence.
On that thought, Robin, are you surprised by how little an issue Brexit has been in this election? The Liberal Democrats, I believe, have made noises about taking the UK back into the single market. And those of us with memory stretching back 8 years will recall that even Brexiters were saying there is no imaginable way the UK would leave the single market. Only a frothing at the mouth, swivel-eyed lunatic would even countenance the very idea.
Who could you be thinking of?
Well, exactly. But are you surprised, Robert? I mean, or is it just electorally understandable that Labour are basically thinking all we have to do is turn up and we will win this thing, so try not to cause any rows on the way?
I think it's totally understandable for one very simple reason. The Brexit referendum in 2016 broke the British political party system. Both parties were split on the issue. The country was split on the issue. 52% voted to leave, 48% voted not to. Neither party wants to reopen those splits. It would do neither of them any good. Labour wants votes from both the people who voted to stay in the EU and people who voted to stay out of the EU. So does the Conservative Party. The period between 2016 and today was so painful for both parties that they really have no desire at all to reopen the wounds, and nor, I don't think, actually do British voters. You look at what people say is uppermost in their minds, they do not say rejoining the European Union.
Well, indeed not. But if we look ahead to what this might mean for UK continental relations, Tessa, which have, for obvious reasons, been somewhat strained these last 8 years, is it possible we'll be looking at a different kind of strain, i.e. that one that I mentioned in the introduction, between a centre-left UK and a Europe which, in certain sectors at least, is getting more cranky and right-wing?
Well, I think that, first of all, Keir Starmer's Labour Party is sort of not particularly left-wing. So if we look at Europe, there are also some of the far-right prime ministers, like Giorgia Meloni, who are not particularly far-right in their European policy. So I think we'll find a lot of common ground between the EU Commission, now led again by Ursula von der Leyen, who is nominally a conservative German, but in fact a rather sort of pragmatic, centrist, moderate to all sides. So I think that should not be a big problem. I think what we will see is, after maybe, the Labour Party and Keir Starmer settling into power, that in the long run, if you want to kickstart this economy, you need to be part of one of the bigger players in this world, which is the EU for the UK. And if you look at how infrastructure programs or green deals are being done in America or in Europe, Britain just can't compete as a country with 67 million in a market of hundreds of millions, either on that side or on the other side of the Atlantic. And this is something where I think we'll really have to wait a little bit, because if the Labour Party wants to do something that makes sense for the economy here, and let alone for the society and the younger people who will now come more and more into the working population and also the travelling population and all this, and realize that they don't have the chances that they had before as EU members, I think it will make much more sense to open up completely. And I think the EU will be also happy to have any attempts by any possible candidate, even the UK, to entertain, thoughts how to bind them closer to the continent.
And Robin, this is just something I'm trying out here. It may not hold any water at all, and I'm apologising in advance for the metaphor I'm about to mix, but is it possible that the UK may end up being somewhat ahead of its time here? Would the election of the Labour Party here be the first indication that the pendulum which swung out a distance to the populist right is beginning to swing back?
Absolutely not.
Oh, good.
Because I think there's a real danger that our European neighbours will misunderstand the result of the election. They will think that Britain is unlike its European neighbours in that it has elected a centre-left government, whereas, as you say, the mood elsewhere seems to be to swing to the right. We have an absolutely ridiculous voting system in this country, which means that the Labour Party may very well win a huge majority in the House of Commons with a relatively small share of the vote. There was a very interesting analysis in the Financial Times which suggested that on current opinion poll ratings, Labour will get about 40% of the vote, 40% share of the vote, and 70% of the seats in the House of Commons. Whereas the right-wing parties, if you put together the Conservative Party and the Reform UK Party, the Nigel Farage Party, they might get about 37% of the vote, slightly less, and about 10% of the seats in the House of Commons. So the mood of the voters will actually be not unlike the mood in other European nations, but the representation in the House of Commons will be wholly disproportionate. What the FT analysis suggested was that the outcome of this election would be the most disproportionate, the most distorted in British political history. And I think there's a real risk that people won't see that and will think, oh, everything's OK in the UK, they've elected a sensible centre-left government.
Well, we will, of course, be following the final week of campaigning across all our shows here on Monocle Radio. But let's now move on. And it has been known for decades that agricultural livestock is a massive contributor to carbon emissions. It has been wondered for nearly as long what might be done about this, the manners of cows being what they are. Denmark, a huge exporter of meat and dairy produce, is to introduce Europe's first tax on carbon emissions associated with agriculture following some months of wrangling with aggrieved farmers. As well as taxing the farmers, Denmark plans to buy out and or reforest and or set aside substantial chunks of current farmland. Tessa, with all due acknowledgement of the difference an economy the relatively small size of Denmark's can make to anything, is this basically good?
I am not a Danish farmer. And I'm not herding cattle. So I always think, it really depends on your perspective. I am very much in favor of this measure because I think people should be aware that beef, unfortunately, even if it might taste well, is one of the big contributors to making this planet hotter in the end. So I think it's quite good to start paying attention to this. I would hope that people get also incentives to, switch from having cows on their meadows to some other form of agriculture in order to also help them survive. But that's in principle, I think it's a good thing. And of course, the Danish are sometimes the trailblazers of this kind of progressive and also green policies. But the same thing is with the airlines putting on sort of extra tax basically for flying. Although I looked a little bit closer at this Lufthansa announcement today, and it's, of course, for long-haul flights in first class that you might get to pay more. And these guys maybe can also afford that. So for people who are now doing one holiday flight per year to some Spanish island or something, they will not have to pay much more. And I think that's also okay because, for many people, this is the only way to actually get off this island is take a flight to Spain.
I do want to come back to the carbon tax on flights thing, Robin, but just going back to this Denmark thing and picking up on what Tessa said about the Danes being trailblazers, might we see here, and I'm asking this question as a fairly unregenerate meat eater, a recognition that meat is probably not the future, that it's probably as well now to start thinking of other things you can be farming? Because my point is we will reach a point at which the artificial alternatives become practically indistinguishable from the real thing. They'll taste the same, they'll feel the same, they will have equivalent or even better nutritional value, and the key moment will come when they cost the same or less.
If I said seaweed to you, would you know why in this context?
Either because this is a thing people can eat, or you're having some sort of episode and we need to call an ambulance.
Neither is the right answer. If you were to feed cattle seaweed rather than their current diet...
Have you tried?
I have not, but many others have. The evidence suggests you could reduce methane emissions by up to 90%. And this is something that the Swedes are actually trying, that Denmark's next-door neighbours. I think it's unrealistic to expect people to stop eating meat. We are a meat-eating species. I don't think it's unrealistic to expect farmers to experiment with different feedstuffs for their cattle and indeed for their pigs and see what effect that has on methane emissions, because there is really good scientific evidence that feeding cattle seaweed, which they appear to like and which appears to do them as much good as any other kind of feed.
This was my next question. Are the cows in favour of eating seaweed?
I've seen no surveys suggesting that cattle are very, very unhappy at the prospect of eating seaweed, at which point I would rest my case. No, but seriously, I mean, it's fine if you can find ways of reducing methane emissions. Yes, of course, do so. I'm much more worried about the melting of the ice cap as a way of releasing methane. But I don't think it's realistic to expect people to stop eating beef. I do think it's perfectly realistic to expect farmers to experiment with different feedstuffs.
Tessa, I just want to go back quickly to this thing that you mentioned Lufthansa have introduced. This is surcharges of up to €72 per ticket to cover the costs of emissions trading. Might something else that we are also beginning to see the end of be cheap flights?
Well, it depends where you live, because there are some countries where you cannot fly within the country, like in France, for example. They have a proper train system, also you can take a TGV from the south of France. That
must be lovely.
And then, well, it's actually not bad, yeah. It's quite a good way of traveling. And I wish a lot of other countries would have also invested more in the train system. You know, Austria, Germany, here in this country, of course, also you just don't, it's so expensive to take a train still. And that's a major issue that I think the European Union, for example, should put much more emphasis on, because that's the way, until we find an alternative for fuel for airplanes that is less damaging to the planet, we really have to step up having people transported on trains around Europe, but it's very, very problematic to think that this is still years off, and to make plane tickets more expensive is, it's a little bit of a helpless measure against keeping people from flying, because a lot of destinations you can't reach. And it's also, in Europe, I know that a lot of young people, because you say they don't, people, we are meat-eating species. I mean, a lot of young people are really not a meat-eating species, as my son. So we went for his birthday, for example, to test the artificial meat and the real steak in one of the restaurants here in London. And it's very difficult already to distinguish between the printed meat and the sort of, originally grown meat. But in any case, I think
printed
a lot of
meat doesn't sound appetizing. I hope they don't call it that.
No, they don't, but we do that sort of, But the thing is that all these things are at the beginning of a development. I think there will be a lot of, and let's hope we'll find other technology that will make planes fly without destroying the planet.
Well, but on the question of passengers on airplanes paying tax, I mean, the UK introduced this 30 years ago, the so-called air passenger duty. I, as it happened, have just booked a long-haul flight for my wife and myself, and because we're old and crotchety, we actually booked what's called premium economy, so one step up from economy. It's a 12-hour overnight flight. We have each paid £200 in tax on top of the not inconsiderable price of the ticket, in order, in part, to discourage people from taking long-haul flights. So I don't think there's actually much evidence that it does act as a disincentive, but it does raise a bit of cash for the exchequer, some of which one could hope governments use in order to offset the effects of carbon emissions.
Well, let's look now at the unsurprising tidings that former Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte has been confirmed as the next Secretary-General of NATO. He will take over from former Norwegian Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg, who has done nearly 10 years in the post, half an hour of which he once spent talking to the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. You can find that on our website. Rutte becomes the fourth Dutchman to hold the position after... Anyone want to name the other three?
The UK.
No, the four Dutchmen.
Oh, the four Dutchmen.
The three previous Dutchmen. I'd be impressed if you get one, to be honest.
Well, I know one is called Jaap de Hoop because I interviewed him.
Yes, he was. That's one.
And I had to learn how to pronounce his name.
One of them has a splendidly Dutch name. Which
More
was,
Dutch than Jaap de Hoop
nearly Dirk Sticker, which is an excellent
What
name.
years was it?
Joseph Lunds is the other one that we are looking for. So, having met a previous Dutch NATO Secretary-General, Robin, are you enthused by the prospect of another one?
I think the Dutch make very good Secretaries-General of NATO, and given the size of the country, they now have produced more NATO Secretaries-General than any other nation.
They have.
And as I was saying, the UK comes second with 3. The Secretary-General of NATO doesn't have an enormous amount of power. He has a certain amount of pushing and pulling power to try and encourage governments to go in particular directions. But it's the governments of the member states that really decide what NATO is going to do. And the problems that NATO faces at the moment are very substantial, particularly, of course, when it comes to the war in Ukraine. So he's going to have a tough time, but he is a very skilled politician and negotiator, so I wish him well.
Tessa, there has been, over the last couple of years, of speculation of who would succeed Stoltenberg, and obviously Mark Rutte's name has come up a lot, but there has been an amount of grumbling, some of which I have been privy off the record and on, about the fact that not one government he presided over went anywhere close to matching what is supposed to be the minimum contribution of NATO members of 2% of GDP. There have been certainly politicians from further east who have bristled somewhat at this.
Yeah, which is true. So Holland now...
They think they'll meet the target in a few years' time, possibly actually this year, but they haven't met it since 1993.
And they are at 1.7% of the GDP now. But having said that, if you look at a comparison and a graph, of course, the highest contributing members are the ones closest to Russia, so Poland with 3.9%, then the US as a sort of big military power. But then already, of course, you have Lithuania and Estonia, smaller countries feeling very, very threatened by the situation. But if you look where the United Kingdom is just at 2.07, so it's not that people are greatly sort of investing more than Holland did. And then you, of course, have... countries that are like Slovenia 1.3 or whatever, or also Turkey with 1.3% of GDP, also not exactly
much
well invested. In this. So you could say that Holland was till now sort of in the middle somewhere, and for a prime minister who famously cycled to his office through Amsterdam, he did quite well in that. But what we can also expect from him, which could be actually quite entertaining, is that he was seen also to play piano in the train station in The Hague sometimes.
People who play piano in train stations should be in The Hague. Of that I am absolutely convinced.
But they should be
but
NATO
in that context.
And sort of play the right melody for these leaders to soften the impact of wars.
Well, it's worth a try, especially if, Robin, President Donald Trump possibly is restored to office and is as susceptible to show tunes as he is reported to have been. That, of course, may be the biggest challenge Mark Rutte faces, other than the ongoing one of Ukraine. How should he prepare for that? Like, is there a way you can prepare for what Donald Trump may or may not do or say about NATO? Because the thing is, you don't quite know, I don't think, what sparks are going to fly when the two brain cells in his head bang together.
Well, that's exactly right. I suspect the best that Mark Rutte can do is have very intensive talks with all the main other NATO heads of government and heads of state and try to come up with a coherent, united policy as to how to deal with the possibility of a United States under President Trump again. One of the big issues for NATO is whether it can conceive of a future in which the United States is not the linchpin of the alliance. Because, it's something that President Macron has spoken of.
This is strategic autonomy,
strategic autonomy, as he calls it. It seems to me that is a direction in which NATO has to at least consider going. It's going to be very painful economically because the US contributes an enormous amount both to the budget and to the manpower and the equipment that NATO relies on. So, there are big issues at stake. And as I say, I don't envy him the task. But the key will be his relationship with the different governments.
And just finally on this, now that the deal is done and it will be Mark Rutte, Tessa, should it, do you think, have gone to somebody from further east? Certainly those politicians further east thought so. Various names were suggested: Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, former Estonian President Kersti Kaljulaid, one or two others. But there was also a pushback at that, the idea that might antagonise Russia overly.
Well, I think we've lost, we've left the station in the debate what might antagonize Vladimir Putin, because, this war has long become so toxic and terrible, especially for the Ukrainian civilians that are sitting under Russian bombs. So that is not the main thing. But if you look now, what happened with Kaja Kallas, I think she has got a lot of respect for the way she was as a prime minister dealing with also budget-wise, with investing in defense and all these kind of things. And she is now nominated and will get the post of the High Representative for Foreign Affairs of the European Union. So in this whole game of the big top jobs for the next years in the European Union and in NATO, we've actually found quite a good balance, I think, between having von der Leyen as a German centrist conservative, the former Portuguese Prime Minister Antonio Costa as coming from the Social Democratic side as the head of the European Council, Kaja Kallas coming from the East, also being a woman for the job of the top EU, like the foreign minister of EU, and then Mark Rutte is sort of centrist material from the center of Europe. So I think that's quite a good setting to face the challenges that will be coming up in the next 5 years.
Well, now, it feels like it has been some time since we heard of the phenomenon of flagpole diplomacy, i.e. the efforts of various jurisdictions to attract headlines and or the gentle mockery of current affairs discussion programmes by building enormous flagpoles. The tallest, as of this broadcast, may be found in Cairo. It is a squeak over 200 metres tall. If you've never seen it, imagine a flagpole, but taller. A proposed new flagpole in Seoul will be roughly half that height, but is nevertheless prompting an amount of to-do among those Koreans who think it and the 21-metre flag it will fly are somewhat crassly nationalistic. Does anybody here have a fixed view on flagpoles in general? I want to establish a benchmark here.
I don't have strong feelings about flagpoles. I understand that if people regard a flag as a symbol of national pride, then the higher it flutters, the greater their pride. So be it.
Tessa, do you have an opinion about flagpoles as a general principle?
Again, of course, I'm not very patriotic myself and don't give so much for flags. But for me, to have a high flagpole is just a little bit of a lost chance for big pride symbols. So my favorite was always the Palace of the Soviets that Stalin meant to build with a huge statue of Lenin on top of it. I mean, that would have been sort of a real signal.
Whose side are you on, Tessa?
Well, I mean, they didn't do it. They built a swimming pool instead. So that was, in the end, maybe a better solution. But in terms of having these kind of big flag things, I don't think they're very harmful, and they're also a little bit silly, maybe.
Well, this is the thing, that it can go one of two ways, Robin. Bulgaria unveiled the EU's highest flagpole about a year ago, a mere 111 metres, and attracted an amount of derision, not least, in fact, from Bulgarians.
Is it a little bit like men who buy themselves very powerful, noisy cars to make up for other deficiencies?
The obvious jokes do get made.
They do, yeah. Look, I mean, the Koreans have, I think, possibly a special reason to feel strongly about this. They have an extremely unfriendly neighbour. And so if they want to literally wave the flag higher than anybody else, well then...
Well, this has gone on closer to the demilitarised zone. Yeah. I forget who put the big flagpole up first, but I think it was North Korea first put up a big flagpole, and then South Korea put up a big flagpole.
But of course the Americans win all the time, don't they? Because they put one on the moon, so it's going to take a while.
It was a tiny one.
Sorry?
It was a tiny flag.
Well,
we just could see it through the...
Tessa, are you seriously taking the view that at the apex of mankind's scientific accomplishment, planting a flag on the actual moon, you're going to gripe that it was too small? Well, there is no pleasing some people.
I mean, it was as an effort to bring it there. I grant you, that was the big thing. The size of the flag doesn't matter so much.
Well, one would hope not. Tessa Szyszkowicz and Robin Lustig, thank you both for joining us. And finally, on today's show, our On This Day historical series recalls a previous American attempt to stand up to Russia. From when Berlin's wall went up in 1961 to when it came down 28 years later, there was no better setting for any US president seeking to reinforce the key point of the Cold War, that the people who built the Berlin Wall and the rest of the continent-straddling fortifications which became known as the Iron Curtain did so not to keep Western Europeans out, but to keep Eastern Europeans in. 4 US presidents visited during the period in which West Berlin was, as the wider West saw it, a vibrant island of democracy amid a stagnant communist swamp. Certainly the foremost artists of the period were not flocking to East Berlin seeking inspiration. Ronald Reagan stood before the Brandenburg Gate in 1987 and memorably challenged his opposite number to let East Berliners decide for themselves if they'd like to drive their Trabants down the Kurfürstendamm.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Jimmy Carter, speaking at the Berlin Airlift Memorial at Tempelhof Airport in 1978, lent West Berlin America's own idealized idea of itself.
As a city of human freedom, human hope, and human rights, Berlin is a light to the whole world. A city on a hill. It cannot be hidden. The eyes of all people are upon you.
Richard Nixon visited West Berlin's Siemens factory and spoke to its workers. There doesn't seem to be much useful audio of this, annoyingly, so we've handed it over to one of his fellow citizens.
Sometimes you must feel that you are very much alone, but always remember we are with you, and always remember that people who are free and who want to be free around the world are with you. In the sense that the people of Berlin stand for freedom and peace, all the people of the world are truly Berliners.
But all were following, spiritually as well as chronologically, the first US president to visit the sequestered city of West Berlin. On June 26, 1963, 22 months after the Berlin Wall had gone up, John F. Kennedy stood before billowing red, white and blue bunting on the steps of Rathaus Schönberg, gazed out at a hefty 6-figure throng and said this:
Freedom is indivisible, and when one man is enslaved, all are not free. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Kennedy was drawing heavily on Cicero, as he'd acknowledged earlier in the speech, updating the boast/warning Civis Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen, for the modern age. Kennedy's statement that he too was a Berliner was not merely a rhetorical expression of the free world support, but a promise of American protection. In the context of the time, it was no small statement. The Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the world to the brink of Armageddon 8 months previously. There was no more likely setting for a similar showdown than West Berlin, the city that Soviet First Secretary Nikita Khrushchev had described in characteristically excitable tones as a splinter in the heart of Europe, which he had promised, as he put it, to eradicate, along with American imperialism generally.
Весь мир знает, что самая империалистическая держава – это Соединенные Штаты Америки.
So on this day, 61 years ago, Kennedy was speaking to two audiences. One was the vast, delirious gathering filling the square, which would be renamed in tragic circumstances 5 months later, John F. Kennedy Platz. The other, much smaller and much less ecstatic, gathered in Khrushchev's office in the Kremlin. Kennedy was not the last US president to wonder how much clearer he needed to make things to his Russian counterpart. Kennedy's message, if never quite acknowledged, was delivered. West Berlin stayed West Berlin, both geographically and politically, until the wall was indeed torn down one glorious night in 1989.
They are here in the thousands, they are here in the tens of thousands. Occasionally they shout, Die Mauer muss weg, the wall must go. Thousands and thousands of West Germans come to make the point that the wall has suddenly become irrelevant. Something, as you can see, almost to party on.
In the decades after Kennedy spoke in Berlin, an urban legend has held that the president misconstrued his colloquial German and that his climactic declaration was heard not as a statement of solidarity from Earth's most powerful individual, but rather as Earth's most powerful individual declaring, somewhat surprisingly, that he was, in fact, a jam donut. While such a confectionery does exist, it is only called by that name elsewhere in Germany. Kennedy's fellow Berliners heard him just as well as Khrushchev did.
Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us.
For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Mullett. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Tessa Szyszkowicz and Robin Lustig. Today's show was produced by Henry Rhys Sheridan and researched by Gunnar Grunlid. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.